welcome to Aviadev Insight Live. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. My name, as many of you hopefully will know by now, is John Howell. I'm the CEO and founder of Aviadev Africa. We are a platform dedicated to improving air connectivity and the fortunes of African aviation. So we're looking at developing air connectivity to, from, but most importantly, that very important intra-African connectivity. This is episode 145 of the Aviadev Insight Africa podcast. So we're 2.5 years in, and we've been pretty consistent. And this is now our third live episode. So thank you everybody for joining us live and taking the time out of your day. Our aim with these sessions is to spend time with some of the leading lights in aviation and to benefit from their knowledge and their experience so that we can develop a better understanding and a deeper understanding of how our industry operates and how it may evolve as a result of the current crisis. Therefore, my very special guest for today's event is Peter Davies. Peter is the founder and CEO of Airline Management Group, and he has a long and distinguished career working in airlines around the globe. So without listing all of them, to give you an idea, some of his achievements include the following, so brace yourselves. Establishing DHL Express services as a major player in establishing and expanding European markets and turning around its business in North and South America. He was involved in the restructuring successfully of Brussels Airlines after the bankruptcy of Sabena. Restructured Air Malta, a very highly political and strategic asset for an economy that's highly dependent on tourism. I know those down in South Africa will sort of understand that as well. Saving it from bankruptcy, navigating the politics of the European Union, and delivering profitability. He also closed and launched an airline for the Trinidadian government in just 3 months, making sure that these islands were continued to retain their connectivity. He launched Oman's first LCC, low-cost carrier Salam Air. He was the Chief Restructuring Officer of South African Airways as well, which I'm sure will feature heavily today and has done in the questions we've received so far. And he also works with Airlink. Now, not that one, not Rogers Airlink, the other Airlink with Harrison Ford is like he's the Indiana Jones versus, Rogers kind of the South African Indiana Jones, I think, with his leather jacket and everything else. So hopefully that one will stick and that nickname will stick. But Airlink is actually an aviation disaster relief coordinating body, and he's helped them grow their capacity, grow their finances, and be more responsive at times of need. So an amazing CV, and we're absolutely honored to have you with us today, Peter.
Thank you, John.
Now, thank you so much. So having attended the excellent AFRA AGA last week, and I know that the AFRA team are with us today, there was a lot of conversation around adapting strategies for survival. We weren't talking about recovery as much as we were talking about how do we survive, how do we ride this out. And we note that, of course, as we've heard through the pandemic, a lot of the African airlines came into this pandemic with weak balance sheets. And COVID has not discriminated whether you were a great profitable airline, as EasyJet told us this week, the losses that they've made, or whether you were a more fragile carrier. It's been a very painful experience for everyone in the ecosystem. So therefore, the aim of the session is to tap into Peter's vast knowledge of the global aviation ecosystem, give everybody out there some practical advice, some coping strategies, and also, obviously, I'm very acutely aware we have lots of South Africans with us today who want to talk about your time with SAA. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Final thing before we get started is just some housekeeping. So as usual, only Peter and I will have access to our cameras and audio, but please do use the chat box I can see. So welcome Renelle and Priya from Mauritius, and tell us where you are. Just a little tip on that. When you're making a comment in the drop down, if you can choose all panelists and attendees, then everyone will get to see it. For some reason, Zoom defaults to just all panelists. So only myself, Peter, can actually read your message. So make sure you do that when you're putting your comments in there. And do use the Q&A. I've had lots of questions in which are formulating what we're going to talk about today. So for the next hour or so, grab yourself a cup of water, a glass of water, a cup of coffee, put your phone on Do Not Disturb, sit back and enjoy. And after that rather long intro, welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you, John. And I'm glad to be here and looking forward to Probably some difficult questions to which I shall always answer honestly, particularly about South African Airways. But I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, we will get to that, as I said, but really I want to get into what your speciality is, which is obviously turnarounds, and you've got this fantastic CV of doing that across over the last sort of three or four decades or so. So as an airline turnaround specialist, of which I'm most definitely, not, and I'm not really versed in this, I'm sure the current environment is obviously really rich with airlines in need of turning around. We know that. So if we've got airlines online and they want to get back on an even keel, where do they start?
Well, I think you've got to differentiate those airlines that were in a bad state pre-COVID-19. I think one of the interesting points, not amusing points, but there's a lot of companies who still have the same management teams that were managing airlines in a pretty poor way. They weren't making the necessary profits. There are obviously big differences between the obvious network carriers that we know about, but there are many airlines who simply find it very difficult to make money in this business. I think IATA themselves have indicated over the previous years that we barely make 2.5% margin, whereas of course those that supply the airline industry, OEMs, aircraft, airports, etc., have made around 14%. So what's interesting about that is that if those management teams and shareholders were finding life difficult before COVID-19, obviously that's now been exacerbated, and I'd be interested to know what they're going to do in terms of making two significant changes. One is, what are they doing about the COVID-19, and what are they going to do to come out and change the business model they had perhaps before? Clearly, the short-term liquidity is on top of mind, and everyone seems to have resolved that to a certain extent. There's a notable few airlines that have gone bust and probably about to go bust. But my concern is actually about 6 months to 1 year's time, and that is if you have overcome your short-term liquidity, it's almost at the expense of mortgaging the future. And therefore, when life returns to some level of normality, hopefully soon, and people start to fly again, I'm confident that people will start flying again. This was always going to be consumer-led, and the vaccine will obviously significantly help that. But when those people start flying again, the balance sheet and the cash flow statements are going to be pretty tattered in those airlines that have been able to raise funds, either even from the government, how do you pay the taxpayer back, or from private funds. So I think inevitably, in terms of the COVID-19 turnaround, there's going to be some way to go before you see the real impact in terms of airlines not being in a good position to recover, particularly if they don't change as they should have done pre-COVID-19. They almost certainly, definitely, we're going to have to change going forward. Now, the other part of the question is what do I find normally in turnarounds pre-COVID-19 in normal days? And I have to say, John, that there's a consistency in all the airlines and organizations I've been involved in. There's a list of common traits, demotivated workforce, lots of plans on the CEO's desk, all gathering dust, never implemented, lack of funds, understanding or not understanding the competition. But I think for me, there's three things that stand out, and the three things I try and find out pretty quickly. One is that most airlines who find themselves in bankruptcy or needing turnaround always blame someone else. It's never their fault. It's always the competition, or the government didn't support me, or the workforce didn't react, or the unions. There's always, it's never management's fault. And specifically on that point, the senior management inevitably have gone. The shareholders have got rid of those. But in my experience, the middle management are the ones that hold the strategic conduit. They're the ones who can be positive, they can be negative, they can be malicious. They hold the connectivity between senior management and the vision and the workforce. And that leads me on to the two other things I do almost immediately. One is, and they're both operational. One's called operational research, I go and see that department fairly quickly to understand what is the intellectual capability of the organization, what do they need, what do they know about the marketplace, what do they know about the competition, where do they see some of the flaws have gone in the past. And secondly is the OCC, the Operational Control Center. That is the hub, that is a nerve center of the airline. And having been a pilot and been on the operational side of airlines, one can establish almost in a couple of hours, to be honest, some of the issues that may be confronting that airline in terms of the processes, the procedures, the interaction between those process procedures and the customer. So I think once you join those three things together, you begin to get a pretty good feel, a heartbeat of how that company has performed. Now, the biggest mistake is to, and some of my colleagues who may be on this call know that I don't spend huge amounts of time going through the balance sheet, cash flow statement, and P&L. Of course I do, but they're historical. They're you know they're there by law because you need to know whether you're solvent or not. The key is to understand how the organisation got into that place and what are we going to do about the future. And the two key things is the workforce and the marketplace. And in my experience, the single biggest competitor to any organisation, any airline, including South African Airways, was the airline itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've kind of given us a bit of a feel. I love the term sort of mortgaging the future. It's a scary term, but of course, those airlines that are having to sell and lease back aircraft to release liquidity, that are selling tickets and having to issue vouchers, which we're seeing a lot of in Europe, etc. You know, that money is already in the system, and you've still got to deliver the product. So that's a real challenge. In terms of who needs to be involved in a turnaround process, I'm sure this depends on the ownership structure of an airline. But for example, if it was a national airline, who do you need on board to make this successful?
Well, I've used the same formula in all my years in turnarounds and reorganisation, and I don't say this glibly. There are three critical stakeholders in any company, and not necessarily just an airline. And I put them in the following order. The first important stakeholder to me is the staff. They're absolutely vital. A very close second are the customers, and a long way third are the shareholders. In my experience, if you approach it only from a shareholder's point of view, you will create a different business plan as to that which you generate if you listen to the staff and your customers. So I've always started with the staff. I talked about the middle management. What I've tended to do is to go straight to grassroots. At least my knowledge about the airline industry is sufficient. I can speak to most people in most jobs and have an understanding of what their job entails. And more importantly, they feel as if I want to be involved in trying to understand. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who do the job. It's not management around a board table. Yeah, we're not flying the aircraft. We're not making the engineering. We're not loading it. We're not feeding. We're not serving our customers. We're not doing the IT stuff. That's been done by well-educated, very well-trained people who have huge amounts of talent. And SAA was totally different in that respect. They just haven't been led properly. It's about leadership at the end of the day. And that just does not emanate from the CEO. That's critically important. He or she have got to create that environment where others work to the best of their ability. But that has to cascade down through the organization. And the moment you get a blockage through supervisory staff, senior management, then it fails. So therefore, it's a lot of hard work in terms of communications. It's a lot of hard work in terms of making sure that the processes and procedures that are within an airline, most of which in bankrupt or turnaround companies are bust or broken, up and down the process, you need to talk to your staff because they're the ones who do that. Now, ironically and without question, in all the organizations I've been involved in, even where people knew they were going to be made redundant as a result of the change of structure, those people were keen to help and make sure that their message and their knowledge about how that process or procedure could be improved was got across in a very professional way. I'm a great believer in human nature. 99% of the people in the world are good. We just often only hear about 1%, I'm afraid. But generally, in my experience, that's been the bedrock of knowledge. And as the CEO or the Chief Restructuring Officer, you have to work hard to make sure that they understand that you are there because you have some knowledge and you want to work with them to provide the best possible service. So staff first, customers a close second, shareholders third.
Yep, understood. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. So let's move into the South African Airways conversation now. So you spent a couple of years with the organization. Of course, it's never out of the news. In my time in African aviation, it's always been in the news. And the first question here is, when you arrived, what did you identify as the major areas that needed improvement? And, how did you set about addressing those?
I'm reminded of a story when I was at SAA and Brussels Airlines, if I may, just 30 seconds. When I got there, all the staff were Sabina people, 99% were Sabina, and they had gone bust, bankrupt. And inevitably, when I asked all the questions of the management team, they said, well, it was Ryanair's fault because they had opened a base at Charleroi, 80 kilometers south of Brussels, and it was their fault. So, and this, they sincerely, a load of rubbish as far as I was concerned, but it was a significant blocking point in their thinking. So I had to shatter that, and I did it by undertaking some research where we tried to establish, of all those people who were then traveling through Charleroi, how many had flown before? Because at that time, 2001, the low-cost market was really developing quite rapidly. And 76% of the people who answered that said they'd never flown before. And with a few other questions, it was clear that the Ryanair had created an opportunity to open the marketplace. So, and what I found in SAA was first, a lot of the management blamed everyone else. Emirates and Qatar and British Airways, those nasty people who are flying 380s, and we closed Cape Town down because of the competition. So there was a great chunk of people who felt that. Certainly the operational cost base was out of sync. We had too many people, but we had an answer for that, which I can come on to later, because of the positivity. I felt that should be allowed to produce some other opportunities for people. The fleet was, half of it was wrong. The other half was okay, but we had to make some improvements there. But critically, and the CEO, Vianney Verana, and I totally agreed on this, I think we found in his office something like, we were aware of Seabridge reports. I think they did 3 of them, McKinsey, Bain, we were all aware of those reports. And I said to Vianney, well, don't bother reading them because they're all going to say the same thing. The key was none were ever implemented. Now, the question is, why were they ever implemented? I don't know. I wasn't there at the time, but that was a fundamental problem. So I believe that SAA could be saved. I still think it could be saved today, but it needs significant determination. Cash is obvious, but it needs a lot more than simply just chucking in money. And in my opinion, if you just simply chuck in money and do nothing else, that's going to be further wasted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this was the question from our colleague, Joachim Vermuten. He was asking, he gave us a lot of detail about, of course, SAA was restructured 2007, 2008, turned a profit 2009, 10, 11. And then he says that according to the Parliament reports, there were 14 turnaround plans from 2012. And of course, on an average basis, it was losing about 6 billion rand a year. So, his question was it unfixable? But you seem to have answered that and said, no, it wasn't. So, I suppose the question that I would like to sort of add on to that is there still room for an SAA in the market as we stand today? Because of course, we had Roger on the podcast a few weeks ago. He's now really expanded regionally and taking regional routes, which was never really SAA's thing. Then you've got Safair doing great things. You've got Comair coming back into the market, Lyft, this new operator domestically. So the domestic market is always been very competitive. The regional market is now being stimulated through Airlink being able to spread their wings. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you've got the carriers like the Middle East guys and the European big guys that are coming into Joburg, Durban, and Cape Town as well. So, do you think there is space for a new SAA, and where does it fit in that mix?
Yes, I do, but I'll give you the reasons why. But I think part of the first part of that question was related to the years of profitability within SAA and what changed. I don't think it's a bit like an accident. There was a series of small things that add up to a catastrophe. But certainly, SAA were blind to what the competition was doing. I think Emirates and other significant carriers, Turkish more latterly, Ethiopian even more latterly, simply came in and said, well, thanks very much. That's nothing to do with open skies. I'm a great believer in open skies. It's up to the airline to make sure they react. And for me, as my understanding, speaking to my colleagues at SAA who were there at the time, was the company and the management, shareholders perhaps, I don't know, did not react to a significant change in the marketplace. And therefore the competition wheeled in their 777s and their 380s and took significant chunks of the market. And SAA never reacted to that. Well, they did. The only way they did react was to acquire some 300 airplanes and change the product. But the rest of the aircraft fleet was left as it was almost in the 1960s. So I'm exaggerating there, but I think the point's made. Pretty poor service, and the pricing structure was out of reach. So it's not good enough to simply say, well, it's not fair that Emirates have a lower cost base, or airlines see. That's no justification at all when your own cost base is exceptionally high. So where you would think you could fly on a direct service overnight to Europe, or to New York or Miami or wherever we wanted to go, Perth, the cost of the operation with old aeroplanes, expensive fuel, antiquated processes and procedures, and a lack of focus on the customer. And here I've got to support the cabin crew, who did a fantastic job for SAA and the ground crew against all adversities. A number of times they had to apologise because they didn't have a certain thing on board. I felt sorry for them. And that should never have happened. That was just outrageous. So if you've got a cost base that's completely out of sync with that of what people are willing to pay by way of fare, it's not going to work. So therefore, you have to lower your fares to compete with someone who's got a lower cost base, even if those people are going 6 hours to the east rather than 12 hours north, thereby saving money. You're not going to find yourself in a position where you can justify the difference in why you would have to pay a higher fare to travel on South African Airways or Air Malta or Sabina, as opposed to that of the competition. If you do have a higher fare, then you've got to justify that to the consumer by having significant product differentiation that the customer wants to buy you. You can't always trade, and here national carriers cause huge misdemeanors in the marketplace. Because you've got a flag on the tower, whatever flag, you just naturally assume that people are going to fly you. The South Africans and the Sport SAA. Well, they did, and up until a few months ago. But that wasn't fair. That's not the way to run a business, on the basis that you slap the flag on the tower and everyone jumps on board regardless of what they cost, because they're doing great for the country. That's not the way to run a business. And many national carriers do that. So I think the reason why South African Airways got themselves into the position is because they just simply buried their head in the sand and added cement. And ignored what was going on around them. And you can blame the government, you can blame these people. No, management takes full responsibility at the end of the day. And if, to be honest with you, if you didn't feel that the shareholders were on your side, then the CEO should resign, because we only did exactly that. To answer your question in terms of course South African Airways justifies its national flag carrier. I think it would be a different model to the one that we've had in the past. I think the feed and the regionalisation is now galloping ahead by Airlink and other airlines. So I think the opportunities that SAA did have a year or so ago are probably on the wane now, simply because the market's moved on and other people are flying SAA or not. But the need to fly the flag intercontinentally, I think it's fundamentally important. South Africa is a great destination, as is indeed Africa. There's almost a year-round tourist opportunity. It's a fantastic continent to visit. So therefore, you'll always have lots of people wishing to go there. Unlike Malta, where the justification for Malta in terms of looking for state aid was because for 5 months of the year, the country was inundated with millions of tourists, but the other 7 months, no. So therefore, there was a strategic conduit requirement to make sure that the island was connected to the rest of the world. South Africa is not quite in the same way because you've got significant competition who fly down here or fly down there year round. So I think there's different arguments. But could I put a business case together to manage a new South African Airways? You bet I could, and it would work.
Right, fantastic. Right,
well, that's not a pitch, by the way. That just came out of my.
The challenge is there. I think Joachim obviously.
One I made earlier.
There's one you made earlier. Very good. Joachim referred to obviously the number of turnaround plans, but you've kind of alluded to the number of CEOs as well that South African Airways has got through, and it's that Chelsea football club in the 2000s that were getting through managers very quickly. It's not it's got to be their fault. People were looking at them when sometimes it's something more systemic. And you need time for these ideas and these people to be given a chance for the success to come in. So I think that's important as well. Other point.
I think on that point,
yeah.
If I think everyone thinks it's beholden upon the shareholders to come up with the answers. I disagree with that. They've got to come up with the money, or at least the ways and means in which the airline or any organisation can survive. But it's up to management at the end of the day. To make the case and to make the argument. And sometimes you have to go well outside the box to make sure that people understand what the opportunities are. And shareholders, particularly governments, are always looking. They have a social responsibility. And we had a plan for that within SAA to understand and recognise social responsibility, but it didn't get very far. So I think there's lots of excuses and all sorts of reasons why the airline failed. The key for me is that if people recognise that and accept that life has to change, there are ways and means of how you can move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you talked about was obviously the cost base, and that's always a big bone of contention and a very emotive subject. But how did you want to, and how would you handle the fact that some people would say that obviously SAA was overstaffed when you looked at the number of staff versus the size of the fleet? Was that a challenge that you felt could be surmounted, or was it we need to look to save money elsewhere?
I think there was a huge opportunity, and still is, to be honest with you, of utilising taxpayers' money far more effectively. The criticism I had, and I addressed this to the board and to the ministers and the department, was that it's perfectly possible to ring fence the requirements of the airline to run a profitable airline, but still employ the 11,000 people that the group employed. I said, but you have to judge the management on the capability of how well run the airline is undertaken, and all the hinterland that surrounds that. But if the government has a social responsibility to employ as many people as possible, and I perfectly understand that as well, then there are ways and means of offering that. But for heaven's sake, make sure that you ring fence the costs purely to run the airline, and so we can run it on the P&L, cash flow and balance sheet basis correctly, and get that bit right. Then the other people that you are employed who are still being paid for by the government, who theoretically don't have a job to do, there's all sorts of opportunities that I felt that we could have employed in terms of developing electronic ideas, looking for fuel alternatives. We've been working with our colleagues down there about how you can convert a tobacco plant into fuel derivatives. I mean, there was all sorts of opportunities where those same number of people could be well employed by the government, by the company, but not necessarily directed specifically on the airline. So therefore, you could distinguish between the two and manage the airline more effectively, whilst making sure that you used the money that was coming into the airline from the taxpayer through the shareholder, that you were thinking outside the box and developing all sorts of new technologies, new ideas. We had huge amounts of space at the airfield that we could have deployed and used more effectively. So I felt there was a business answer, but we never pursued that, I'm afraid. But I still think that's an alternative.
Absolutely. So we'll move the conversation on in a second to talk about fleet, talk about network, etc., and cooperation. But we've had a question from Talani Keshwa, who said, "I feel national carriers of this nature feel the need to provide for society's welfare at the expense of profit maximization, as running the business strictly for profit might not sit well with nationals. What's your take?" So I guess the question is a national carrier a strategic asset that can lose money on its own but provide an overall economic benefit, or should it run for the profit to put money back into the fiscus?
Well, I believe that the national carriers that's owned by the state can make a profit, but a profit often is construed as a dirty word. I think you have to look at it from the point of view of the taxpayer. And no taxpayer in any country in the world just wants to chuck money into the abyss. And not, for the sake of, as I said earlier, just flying a national flag. So they need to be satisfied that what money they are given the government or to the airline via the government is being spent wisely, as opposed to wasted. Now, in my opinion, there was huge amounts of money wasted over many years. And I'm not talking about corruption or that inevitably those things were happening, I'm afraid, too, although I wasn't aware of that. I didn't get involved in that. But certainly, no, I believe that national carriers funded by the taxpayer should be responsible to the taxpayer. You have to remember at the time, the government is a movable feast in as much that ministers will come and ministers will go. Departments will come and departments will go. Taxpayer tends to stay. So therefore, the taxpayer becomes really relevant in this sense. And surely any taxpayer wants to make sure that their well-earned money and hard-earned tax is being spent wisely. So I'm of the opinion that yes, you can run a national carrier, you can be socially responsible, and you can at least make sure you're not a drain on the taxpayers' money. And that's different to making a profit.
Yeah.
Justifiable. Don't forget to, because you're not paying dividends as such as if it was a private company, but nonetheless, you need income coming in to create the investment capital, because you do need to change your aircraft, you do need to change your product, you need to invest in certain ideas. That requires capital investment. So it's a moot point, but certainly my principal answer is don't waste the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you've covered that. So let's talk a little bit about fleet. I see the questions coming in, so thank you for that, and we'll get to those. When you came in, you were quite involved, or you were involved in getting the 350s that provided this ray of sunshine for a period. So tell us about the thought process behind that and what you came into and where you felt that there was need for change in the fleet.
Well, Vianney approached he was new to the airline industry and grasped pretty quickly that route profitability is vitally important. And part of that is how much does it cost you to fly the aircraft? It's all pretty simple stuff. I found the airline industry to be quite simple. It's complex, but it's not complicated. It's complex what lies behind it. So therefore, we started immediately doing work in terms of we were flying a 346. It was an antiquated aeroplane. We owned, I think, 6 of them. So the asset cost was cheaper. The fuel was expensive. More importantly, the product on board was awful. And there was no investment opportunities to upgrade either the eco cabin or the important business class cabin in terms of the amount of revenue it generated with the entire aircraft. So it became fairly obvious pretty quickly that we need to change the quality of the product. We could have invested money in the 346 airframe, but why bother? They were 20-year-old aeroplanes. You're never going to go from 4 engines to 2 engines. So we made the decision pretty quickly. We need to find a replacement. So we had lots of conversations and detailed analysis with our friends at Boeing and Airbus. The conclusion we came to was that the 350 was the most appropriate aircraft for our need. Now, the story about that is a huge amount of operational research, intellectual input from all sorts of brilliant people who are working for SAA, all the engineering people, the pilots, flight operations, the marketing people, all had their input into that choice of aircraft. What happened was, and SAA is always blamed for not being responsive. It was January last year in Dublin. I was with a new CFO, Dion Fredericks, and our fleet manager. And we were meeting all the lessors. Every year they meet in Dublin. So all our lessors and banks were in one place. And Dion was new to the industry, so I could introduce him to all our banks. And every single one of the meetings we had, and we had about 18 of them, I think, I asked the question, have you got any spare 350s in your fleet that's not being used? And every single one, apart from one, said no. One said we got two. That was on January, I think it was January the 20th in Dublin. So we got to work immediately, and very quickly, almost that day. I think we had meetings that evening, bang, 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 bang. They were owned by Hainan, who were not using them. They were on the ramp in the Far East. By February the 21st, I think it was, the board, with the approval of the DPE, had approved us to use 350s. Not the detail, but the principle. Okay, fine. The business case seems to work. They interrogated us quite rightly in the most profound way, which is part of their responsibility, as did the DPE. But within 1 month, we got approval to go ahead and start negotiating for those aircraft. And the aircraft were introduced in the we had to go through hoops to get the approvals. SAA were obliging in terms of the speed at which they allowed the aircraft to be registered and approved and all the things you have to go for to make sure we don't hurt anyone. And that aircraft was flying in December. I left at the end of January this year. And my good friends were telling me that only after 6 weeks of operation on the 350 on the New York route, it was at least breaking even and beginning to show profits, whereas the 346 never did, or it was intermittently. So there's just one example, John, where if you put your right mind, have all the right arguments, you can get things done quite quickly. So the fleet argument was basically to move to a 350 type aircraft. And replace the 346s and 343s, the 4-engine aircraft. We had a fleet of 330, 300s and 200s. We felt that the 330, 300s was the right aircraft, the 200s would go. And the short-haul aircraft, the A320, 319 was a good aeroplane, and we wanted to keep that. Bearing in mind, of course, we wanted to keep a single fleet, i.e. Airbus, because of the opportunities to mix fleets, mix crews. So huge amounts of work were done on the fleet, but that was the conclusion that we came to, and the board and the DP had approved that, and we were moving towards that conclusion, which is a shame that it didn't materialize, but who knows, perhaps it will one day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. We're going to stick with SAA just for a tiny bit longer. Then we're going to zoom out a bit because we've had some questions about kind of the African context as well. But we had a question from David Aher, who works with Tusker Consulting, and he was asking about cooperation. You know, was there room for more joint ventures? And do you see that for the future? Because, of course, we're seeing lots of announcements in Africa at the moment about interlines, which is kind of that initial starting point of creating something going towards code sharing, etc., and all the rest of it. But did you feel there was enough cooperation and that you did the right things, or the SAA got in with the right people?
Well, the part of the development plan that we worked on post all the 14 different plans we saw, which we more or less ignored. SAA was in a difficult position. It had a relationship with SAA Alliance, and I won't comment on that, but that could have been improved in my opinion, and the relationships with other airlines around the group. But the key thing for South African Airways was that it's geographically exposed. It's the other end of the world from where I am currently, and there's 4 airlines that fall into that category: Air New Zealand, Qantas, South African Airways, and LATAM. Now, Air New Zealand makes a thumping good profit. Qantas makes a thumping good profit. South Africa makes a thumping great loss, as does LATAM. And if you look at LATAM and South African Airways in the way in which they've been managed, there's a huge number of similarities as opposed to Air New Zealand and Qantas, completely different. I appreciate the marketplace is different, but New Zealand is a much smaller market to South Africa. So we felt, and we did a lot of operational research in this, we couldn't stand alone. We couldn't justify flying direct to Hong Kong because we just simply couldn't, with a 346 aircraft, compete against Cathay, who had a 777, much better, superior product. And it's a great product on Cathay. We couldn't compete against that. And Emirates and Qatar and others were simply offering half our fares to go via Emirates, via the Gulf. So it was always pretty difficult to do that. So we had to look for friends and relatives, as I call them, where we could have a relationship. Now, Interline is an amoeba-like introduction to relationships between airlines. And it doesn't mean a huge amount. It's more for the satisfaction of the customer than it is for the airline per se. And then you move on to code shares and et cetera, et cetera. My view, and we pursued this in SAA, was to seek joint ventures. My good friend Ben Leon, who was on the commercial side, he worked hard with Air Mauritius. I saw SOMAS, and we had a brief conversation about how we could develop a relationship. We felt that Mauritius could be an alternative hub to that of perhaps the Middle East. So we worked hard on developing a business plan. We then had to submit that correctly to the authorities, the competitive authorities, both in Mauritius and in South Africa, both of whom eventually approved it. It took some months, obviously. And the idea was then to, because we took another 2 350s, which indeed were the Air Mauritius 350s, and the logic, bearing in mind that one of the ways of making money in this business is to keep your asset in the air as much as possible, and South Africa were very poor at that, was to originate an aircraft on a code share, but on a joint venture. So we were sharing the profits and losses in Mauritius, Johannesburg, New York, which was something like 21 hours of utilization and a reasonably rapid turnaround in New York and back again. So we were trying to get the aircraft into the air more often. We could link Hong Kong to via Mauritius. India became an opportunity because we simply couldn't get the cost down to fly direct. The diaspora movement between South Africa and India is important, but Emirates offer them very low fares. So at the end of the day, people generally, the general public, want to fly as safely as they can, as cheaply as they can. And if that means diverting through Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Qatar for 3 or 4 hours, well, so be it, if they can save themselves a lot of money. So I think there was an opportunity, and we started working on it, to develop joint venture relationships. We were talking to various airlines around the world, big ones and small ones, to build up that pattern of supporting the network. So you flew the prime routes, the intercontinental prime routes, the Londons and New Yorks, Frankfurt's, and then developed a relationship, because of all the CEOs of the world, I know a lot of them at the IATA conference, and Vianney, when I took him to the first one, which I think was in Sydney, was bowled over, literally bowled over, by the response by his competitive CEOs to saying, thank goodness you're at the helm of SAA, because we want you guys to survive. And that was the feeling of the competition. So it's got everything going for it, and I believe it still has.
Great answer. So two more maybe short ones. I know that my friends from Cape Town Air Access are on the call. They haven't posed this question, but I want to pose it. Did SAA miss a trick by obviously just focusing on Joburg in terms of the network strategy and leaving Cape Town to do it themselves?
For sure. I mean, I simply, to this day, and I've probably got colleagues of mine who are probably swearing at me for saying this, but I just don't understand the intellectual, practical, pragmatic, common sense logic of why you would pull out of one of the most fantastic cities of the world and one of the highly density tourists. I mean, 76%, I think, of all people that travel on tourist visas to South Africa travel via Cape Town. So why on earth SAA gave that up, I don't know. When I was there, it was at that time, we didn't have the equipment to get back into it. We did look at, could we run a low-cost airline, a long-haul airline? One of the options we had was, let's take the 346s, they're cheap airframes, expensive in fuel, completely strip the aircraft and put, I think we could get 420 eco seats and just fly those like a Eurowings, just linking Cape Town. But everything just, you had these ideas and then they got lost and then they went into committee and then they came back out again and, oh my goodness, we haven't got the money to do that. And that was one of the fundamental problems, Cape Town being classic, of where I said to the minister, I think I upset him and made him quite angry, but he said, look, why can't this work, for heaven's sake? You know, and I understand his frustration. And I said, sir, if you only give us enough money for lunch and no money for dinner, then all of us are going to be worrying how we're going to feed ourselves tonight. So it was the pace at which the investment came through and the confidence through the banking system that we had cash to last us for some time to make those sort of decisions. And because that cash was not always there, then you couldn't resolve yourself to fix those problems. But Cape Town, I thought, was a bad mistake. The market, I mean, BA, I think in post-COVID or pre-COVID days, they were flying 2 747s a day. I mean, Emirates flying, 380 or 777. I mean, the marketplace has been taken up, and I still think there's huge opportunities there for long haul travel. And you know, one of the great things about the national flag carrier, and South African Airways is no different, is that you can appeal to people overseas because the flag carrier does represent the values of the country. And therefore, the SAA, particularly the cabin crew I mentioned earlier, did present themselves in such a way that you felt, as soon as you go on board that aircraft in New York or wherever, that you were part of the African, and particularly the South African environment. If we had a better product on board, had we helped our cabin crew more, then that would have been further enhanced. And I think that becomes quite important. Yeah, you have to remember that the vital management marketing point, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think 75% or 70% of the passengers traveling on South African Airways, the tickets were bought overseas. There were overseas travelers. Now, there may have been some VFR traffic in that, South Africans returning home, of course. But the bulk of people buying South Africa Airways tickets were overseas visitors, not those emanating within the country. Ironically, the people who are traveling on Emirates was quite the reverse. There were a lot of South Africans who wanted to fly out with the cheapest possible rate. So there's a moral there. But I think there was a huge opportunity to really bolster the South African Airways brand, which is still held in high esteem, as I said. Working in relationship, we were trying to forge a joint venture relationship with Airline. I thought that was fundamentally important with Roger's company, both in terms of, they were able to fly the much thinner routes because of the aircraft type they've got. We couldn't possibly get into that, and we didn't want to either. So that was a relationship that was always, I mean, Roger and I must have seen each other once every 2 or 3 weeks to discuss how we can move forward. We came out with, I think, jointly 3 or 4 different business plans, none of which got any traction for all sorts of reasons, but that was a shame. So when people say to me that does South African Airways survive? Of course it can. And still can today. It needs the wherewithal to do it, and a clear mind and a focus in terms of why won't you allow this company, that's the question to ask, why won't you allow this company to proliferate and operate and use taxpayers' money to the best of its ability? And that may not be making a profit per se. I get the intellectual point there. But for heaven's sake, it was there, it's still there in my opinion.
So potentially, it's short-termist, even what we're hearing at the moment. And you said before, you've got your little book there with your imaginary SAA business plan. So Sean Bradley from Barca he just said, how would a new SAA achieve the load factors and the yield to give return on investment in this particularly difficult climate, not just from a competition perspective, but also the fact that inbound travel is really struggling. We know the load factors are very low on the international travel into South Africa, partly because me and you are both in lockdown here in the UK, so it's very hard to travel. And of course, affordability is a big challenge in terms of moving around. So, just really, really quickly, just a couple of things, I suppose, to respond to Sean's point.
Well, yeah, clearly to launch an airline today may be somewhat silly, but the time can be used effectively. So if I was in a position, if I was still the Chief Restructuring Officer at SAA, my time would be spent on well, what sort of model can we build out of this to look at pro-COVID-19. So the vaccine hopefully is around the corner. Consumer confidence will come back. I'm a great believer in human nature, and I think certainly capacity will be down probably by 30% globally, but I think the airplanes will start to fill up pretty quickly. There is a question of disposable income. Obviously, people's private income has been affected, but equally, a lot of people have been able to save money. So I think the time now, today, will be spent on how you would develop an airline, and that has to be the lowest possible gas cost per available seat kilometre, or lowest seat cost, however you do that. The best possible product, recognising it's got to be significantly different to that of the past. Although if you look at the product on board the A330-300 SAA, for those of you who have travelled, it was a stupendous product, fantastic. The first airline, I think, to introduce 4 across in business class, and the ecosystem was pretty good. Bad IFE, but that could be improved. So that can be put together and work on understanding how South African Airways, under its existing brand, can be the strategic conduit linking various parts of the key parts of the world. And obviously Europe, North America, I think will become fundamentally important as we move on. And likewise with our friends in China and the Far East. But there's ways and means in which you can develop those relationships, not necessarily directly with Star Alliance, to be honest. That would be a question I would have. But no, I would spend the time now developing my plans to make sure that when I was in a position, which won't be that too far away, that SAA could respond quickly. And I believe the strength of the brand is still in the marketplace. The quality of the people is still there, limited. A lot of good people have left pre-COVID-19 because they got frustrated. But I think you can entice those people back into the environment. So I would never give up on the basis, but it needs to be funded and funded correctly. Either the government wipes off and has a clean slate, it's not going to get that money back, or it seeks private money. But to seek private money, that's a whole different game plan to what we have. One thing I would say, John, is coming back to Cape Town, I remember I was in a select committee in December 2017. At that time, the country was, the company's looking for 9 billion, I think, rand. And I've met the chairman for the first time, GB, and a member of parliament said to me, "So, Mr. Davies, you're the airline expert," in a rather facetious way. "Is this enough?" I said, "No, sir, we need 18 billion. And because everyone fell off their chair. But I believe in being quite honest and pragmatic, and why just give half the story if you're going to fail. So it was always difficult to get back from that situation to create the right investment. But moving forward, use the time now. Don't launch the airline tomorrow, obviously, but use the time and come back into the marketplace with a much stronger product in a few months' time. The capability is there.
Yeah, and that's the message here, I suppose, with a turnaround is there are things you can do now, but you also have to continue to invest in the future. It's a slow process. It's turning around the tanker, not just spinning around the car. So, and thank you, Sean, for correcting us on your job title as well. Appreciate that. So I promised we'd zoom out. We're going to stay on for an extra few minutes, but we had a question from my good friend Eric Ntenga, who is the senior policy advisor for air transport at the African Union. So he's involved very much in promoting SAATM and opening the skies. But his question is actually slightly different. He's talking about they are developing policy guidelines for negotiating air service agreements between African states and countries outside of Africa. So what things should be taken into consideration to ensure that the African aviation industry doesn't continue to suffer? Because we know that 80% of travelers that arrive into Africa come on non-African airlines. And I always say, to an extent, that horse has bolted, which is why we now need to look domestically and regionally first and foremost in this rebuild process, and stop getting all misty-eyed and romantic about the super long-haul destinations that we want to fly to. You need to develop that local feed first with affordable aircraft where you can get high utilization, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you feel about that? And what would your advice be to him when they're talking to, countries outside about access into Africa? Do we need them more than they need us, or vice versa?
Well, Africa is a critical destination for these carriers, particularly the hub carriers. There is an argument, people like Emirates and Qatar and others will with the reduction in capacity through the hubs, the 787-350 aircraft are as effective in terms of their seat cost as a 380, but you can fly them point to point. So therefore, bypassing the hubs. That's a question that is mute at the present moment, but that means that you can open up more destinations, more thinner routes with aircraft, and perhaps create the demand very much in the same vein that our friends in Europe, Ryanair and Wizz and others have done. My basic view is that I believe in open skies. I believe in competition. And that the ultimate responsibility is with the management of those organisations to make sure they present and prepare the best possible product that represents their country. And I think you can do that in liaison and with joint ventures. I think there's ways and means of where you don't have to capitulate your future to other carriers, particularly overseas foreign carriers, and that's always perceived to be not a nasty word. But the argument I've had with, and indeed with my colleagues in South African Airways, I said, listen, you should be grateful for the Emirates and the Qatar and the Turkish and the Ethiopian. They sort of looked at me, I said, why? They said, well, because they're increasing the size of the market. There's more and more people coming to your country and to the African continent as a result of that dramatic increase in capacity. And the fares are not cheap. This is not a low-cost route per se relative to their own cost structures. So therefore, I see the opportunity as listen, post-COVID-19, when the world gets back to some sort of level of sensibility, and that's clearly going to be 22, 23 to a certain extent, particularly long haul, then why wouldn't you want to take advantage of developing your own continent in making sure that you don't forbid foreign carriers to come in, and you can manage that to a certain extent through Fifth, Sixth and other freedom rights, but create a home environment or a country environment that's honest, genuine, is financed properly, financed correctly, and management, choose the right management team, and that management team be allowed to run according to what the stakeholders' requirements are. So I think that opportunity does exist. So I would keep an open mind and keep an open skies in terms of the opportunities that provides. So don't see the external foreign competition. I'm not saying that because I'm a Brit. I'm just saying that from my worldwide experience of talking to governments and boards, saying, listen, we want to take advantage of these people. We want to take their market share. And we've never been on the front foot. South African Airways has never been on the, I'm getting quite passionate now, never been on the front foot. It's always been on the back foot. Put the airline on the front foot, allow it to fight in the marketplace, and you'll start to see market share increasing and the break-even point, the taxpayers' money being returned satisfactory. If you allow that to happen, all sorts of things, there's enough talent, expertise, passion on the African continent for that to happen.
Absolutely. And that's such a great rallying cry. I mean, you mentioned Ryanair earlier in the conversation, and, as you quite rightly pointed out, what they did is they stimulated a whole new market. And that's what the opportunity is in Africa. You bring the cost to a level where the average person can suddenly fly, and you then put in all the geographic reasons that we know with Africa that you don't have alternative transport. And you can see this already happening in the South African market. That competition is driving up the frequencies from Cape Town to Joburg, for example, which is in the top 10 busiest routes globally. You've got competition on that route, and you've got all these frequencies, and it would be amazing to see that happen in other parts of Africa. I think the big challenge is that you've got private carriers competing with those that are being supported by governments, but and that just, it really makes it hard to then say we have a freely competitive environment when there are not many industries where private sector and public sector really fight head to head, because they're obviously getting support. So final question for you then, because we've got to wrap up now. Thank you everybody for listening, and thanks for your questions. I'll send all these over to Peter, and you can connect with him on LinkedIn, and we'll put this out on YouTube and the podcast. But how do you see the future for Africa? Are you positive about the next few years for African aviation?
For sure, yeah. I'm not being sycophantic. I don't have to be. It's just a fabulous continent for all sorts of reasons, in terms of not just in tourism, but in terms of natural resources, capability. I mentioned this tobacco plant. There's this particular tobacco plant grows in very poor conditions, and you can imagine great swathes of the African continent being given over to developing that type of opportunity. It's just one of many opportunities. But South Africa will always be Africa will always be a destination that people want to go to, whether it's in the north or the south or the middle. And I've been all over the African continent, and they're wonderful people, and those who visit, from tourists and those who deal and have business dealings, want to continue going there. So the opportunities for the African continent, in terms of taking advantage of what the airline industry has created, in terms of, we have to remember the airline industry has been a great facilitator for global trade in the last 20 years, and that's not going to diminish, that's going to increase. COVID-19 aside, that's unfortunate and a terrible human blip, but we'll get through that. So rest assured, as far as I'm concerned, there's every opportunity looking forward to developing the African continent, but it needs clear mind, focus, uncorruptible investment, and a fair wind, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I know my friend Aaron Munyetsi is on the call, and he loves a good African saying, but the one that we've been using quite a lot the last few months is never let a good crisis go to waste, which was Winston Churchill. And I think that's exactly what we have to do. We have to be innovative. We have to really sort of think about how we build back differently to build back better, to quote that as well. And I think we've got some great tips today. So thank you so much for your time, Peter, and giving us that wonderful expertise.
Thank you, everyone.
Really enjoyed it.
Good questions.
Thank you.
Good questions. I'll try and get to answer them over the next few days if I'm allowed to, John. So
absolutely, we'll send you the transcripts and the questions, and Peter will come back to everybody out there. And thank you to everybody who spent the time this morning to join us live today. The session's going to be available early next week on YouTube and podcast. So if you know somebody that wasn't able to meet the timings today, send it over to them, send them the link, share it with somebody in your network you think will benefit. And we'd also really appreciate if you could leave a review on the Apple Store as well, so that we could be found by more people. We are listened to in over 165 countries around the world, which is fantastic and shows that there is an appetite for African aviation. But let's keep spreading the word, because it's free wherever anybody listens. Our next session is going to take place on the 18th of December. I will unveil our very special guest at the beginning of December, but it is a wonderful lady who's very heavily involved in the African aviation industry. So take your guesses. And I'd also welcome any suggestions with regards to future guests you'd like us to invite, how we can improve the experience. Until we meet again and I can be back in wonderful Africa, stay safe, stay well. We'll travel again soon, and I can't wait to see you all. So thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.